Hey, I'm Burrard-Lucas, a wildlife photographer. In this video I'm going to compare a full frame mirrorless camera with an APS-C camera. So here I have the A7 which is a full frame camera, so a 35mm sensor. And on the other side I have the a6700, which has a smaller crop sensor. So this is an APS-C size sensor, which gives a crop factor of about 1.5. And while this video specifically compares the A7 with the a6700, I'm going to try and keep the points fairly general, such that they would apply to any crop sensor camera versus full frame camera of a similar generation. I'm going to be making this comparison as a wildlife photographer, so how that applies in my field of photography, and mostly from the perspective of shooting stills rather than video. So if we start with the most obvious difference between these two cameras, the first is the size. The bigger sensor has a bigger body to go around it, but Sony full frame cameras are still very compact for what they offer, and so the size difference between these two cameras isn't quite as significant as you might think. The main dimension in which the crop sensor is smaller is in the height. The A7 has an electronic eyepiece, an EVF, that sits up above the plane of the camera body, so it makes it quite a bit taller, but that results in a much larger EVF than on the a6700. In terms of depth and width, the cameras aren't too dissimilar. Perhaps where there's more significant difference when it comes to the size is in the lenses. A crop sensor can make use of smaller lenses intended for crop sensors, and those do tend to be lighter and more compact. You can use full frame lenses on a crop sensor, but those full frame lenses do tend to be larger and heavier and more expensive. So you don't necessarily get the benefit of that compactness. You can use a lens intended for crop sensors on a full frame camera, but when you do that, the camera will only use the central part of the sensor. It won't use the full sensor. So you're not really getting the benefits of your full frame camera. And if you're using a crop sensor camera, you can either go ahead and use those full frame lenses, the FE lenses, or the E lenses, which are for that APS-C camera system. So the next obvious difference between the two systems is the price. You've got a bigger sensor in this camera. Often you get more advanced features in the full frame camera, and it does cost more to reflect that. Not only does the camera cost more, but also then if you're having to get full frame lenses, they tend to cost more as well. So you can save quite a bit by going for a crop sensor system. When you put a 50mm lens on a full frame sensor, you get a 50mm lens. If you then put that same lens onto the crop sensor, you get what's called a crop factor. And with an APS-C size sensor, like in this a6700, that has a crop factor of 1.5. So a 50mm lens equivalent on the crop sensor becomes 50 times 1.5, so that's about 75mm. So that same lens is actually a longer focal length lens when you put it on the crop sensor, which has advantages and disadvantages. When you're photographing wildlife, often that wildlife is far from the camera, and you need a longer focal length in order to fill the frame with your subject, and so having a crop factor actually can be pretty handy. If you have a 200mm lens, that's actually the equivalent of a 300mm lens for a full frame camera, so you get more reach. Generally speaking, longer lenses tend to cost more, and so if you can get away with a shorter lens on a crop sensor, which gives you that extra reach anyway, then again you can save money. Where the crop factor becomes a disadvantage is when you want to shoot wide angle. And so if you put a 16mm lens on a full frame camera, you can shoot a really wide field of view. But that field of view on a crop sensor is much narrower. So to get an equivalent of, say, a 16mm on the full frame, you need to go for 10 or 11mm on the APS-C system. So one thing to note on this is that on a full frame camera you can actually shoot in APS-C mode, and what that will do is it will tell the camera just to use the center part of the sensor and to ignore the edges, which gives you the exact same effect as the crop factor on the APS-C camera. So you obviously lose the benefits of the full frame sensor, but it gives you that crop factor which allows you to punch in a bit further, which is useful if you don't need the extra resolution that the full sensor offers. So probably where there's the most significant benefit of the full frame sensor is in image quality. So a bigger sensor collects more light, which results in better low light performance, higher dynamic range, better image quality, more megapixels. Now, having said that, these are the latest generation of digital cameras and the image quality of both is incredible. So if you go for a crop sensor, you're not going to look at the images and think the quality is lacking. So another area where you'll notice a difference between a larger sensor and a smaller sensor is in the depth of field that you get. As your sensor size decreases, you actually get more depth of field in your pictures. So if you're shooting a fast lens on a full frame, let's say you're shooting at f1.4, you get a very shallow depth of field, which means you get a very blurry background and foreground and allows you to isolate your subject. If you shoot that same aperture on a crop sensor, you actually get a bit more depth of field, so that background and foreground are a bit less out of focus. So the next area where the larger system has an advantage is in ergonomics. There's just more room for controls, for a larger grip, to produce a camera that just feels a bit more substantial in the hand. And you know, this is personal preference. You may really like having something that's really small and lightweight and easy to pack, but on the other hand, when you're actually using the camera, you may prefer to have something that's more substantial. And so for me, I find that just the placement of the buttons, they're just easier to reach, to get your fingers to without feeling cramped. There's more prominent controls. The way that dials stick up means that even when not looking, it's easier to find buttons and change settings. Whereas something that's more compact like this, it can be more fiddly. And so there is a trade-off between getting the most compact camera and getting one that's maybe a bit more ergonomic, feels better in the hand, and that's easier to manipulate when you're changing settings. I've already touched on this, but the electronic viewfinder on the full frame camera is considerably larger, which makes it much nicer to look through. It gives you a much better feel of your picture that you're taking, whereas this, it is tiny. So when you're using the screen to shoot, which I often am anyway, there's much less of a difference between the more compact system. But yeah, if you find you want to use the EVF mostly, and actually put your eye to the back of the camera, you do get a considerably nicer experience with the larger EVF. So now let's talk autofocus. With mirrorless cameras, the cameras are looking at the picture hitting the sensor and analysing that picture, and often using that to determine what you're trying to focus on. So the autofocus engine on these mirrorless cameras really does rely on that imaging sensor. So in the same way that you get better image quality from a larger sensor, that larger sensor is also giving the autofocus engine more information. I noticed when using these two cameras, particularly in low light situations, the full frame system collecting more light does enable the autofocus to work slightly snappier, slightly quicker, I found. But surprisingly, the difference really wasn't that noticeable, and that's because this camera, the a6700, has a newer autofocus engine than the a7 IV. This is a newer camera and it has the latest and greatest Sony autofocus engine in it. Really, that meant that this had several features that were more advanced than this camera. For example, subject recognition and the whole AI autofocus engine enables this to recognize and focus on a wider range of subjects, such as insects and aeroplanes, that this camera simply doesn't have. So what that illustrates is that sensor size does matter, particularly in low light, but more important than that is probably just how new the camera is and how premium it is, because the more premium and the newer cameras tend to have more advanced high-end autofocus abilities. So the other thing that affects autofocus is the lens you're using. The more premium G-Master lenses tend to be more accurate and faster at focusing, and so that has a big impact as well. So it's not just about the camera you're using, the lens also matters. Depending on the specific cameras you're comparing, there may be other differences between full frame, larger camera bodies and those smaller crop sensor bodies. So for example, this camera, the full frame camera, has room for 2 card slots, whereas the APS-C camera only has room for 1. So you might want to shoot to 2 cards simultaneously so that you've got some backup. Likewise with the ports, the A7 IV has room for a lot more ports. For example, a full-size HDMI port, which you may find useful if you're shooting a lot of video. In comparison, the ports on the A6700 are much more limited. And so, for example, this doesn't even have a multi-port for using a wired shutter release, which for me means I can't use this in a camera trap, for example, which is a real shame. Both cameras do, however, have room for the same battery, the FZ100, which I found performs really well and gives you plenty of battery life. As far as I'm aware, there's no battery grip that you can add to the A6700, whereas the A7 range does have a battery grip, which is useful particularly with longer lenses, and also a vertical shooting grip. So now let's have a look at some of the images I shot with these cameras in Kenya. Looking through the pictures, it's very hard to spot any noticeable difference in the image quality, and also the autofocus accuracy seemed very good on both. For me, the greatest difference in the two systems is in the lenses you choose to use. With the a6700 you can save considerably by getting E-mount lenses for APS-C cameras. However, if you want the best optical performance, then you'd probably want to use the G-Master lenses with a full frame camera. With this in mind, your choice comes down to a more expensive and larger system that will give you unrivaled image quality and also considerably better low light performance, or a more compact system that is easier to carry around and will also cost less. I hope you found that comparison useful, and thank you for watching.